Norfolk, Virginia, August 4th, 1943, and a Liberty ship, fresh from the Atlantic crossing, disgorges its human cargo onto American soil. But these are not the usual passengers one might expect at this busy port. They are German soldiers, veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, men who just months ago were fighting in the scorching deserts of Tunisia and Libya, who expected to die in battle or perhaps face the nightmare of Soviet captivity. Instead, they find themselves stepping onto the docks of a nation they have been told is weak and decadent, a country supposedly on the verge of collapse under the weight of its own corruption. What they do not yet know, what they cannot possibly imagine as they shuffle in their dusty desert uniforms down the gangplank, is that within days they will experience something that will fundamentally reshape their understanding of America, of the war, and of the propaganda they have been fed for years. That moment of revelation will come not on a battlefield, not through any grand gesture of diplomacy, but over breakfast, in a prisoner of war camp mess hall. Among these new arrivals is a young German private, dusty and exhausted after weeks of travel from North Africa to Algeria, from Algeria across the submarine-infested Atlantic, surviving on minimal rations that barely kept body and soul together. He has written in his diary about the journey, about the fear of torpedo attacks, about the uncertainty of his fate, about wondering whether the rumours of American brutality could possibly be true. The propaganda ministry in Berlin has spent years painting a picture of the United States as a nation of gangsters and criminals, a place where violence rules the streets and where German soldiers could expect nothing but harsh treatment and starvation. Japanese broadcasts picked up by German radio operators speak of Americans who torture prisoners, who violate every convention of civilized warfare. These young men have been told that to surrender to the Americans is only marginally better than falling into Russian hands, that they should fight to the death rather than face the horrors of American captivity. Standing on the Norfolk docks in the August heat, these German soldiers cannot know that everything they have been told is about to be proven spectacularly wrong. The processing begins immediately, as American military police escort the prisoners through the reception procedures, documenting their names and ranks, checking for wounds or illness, separating officers from enlisted men according to the protocols of the Geneva Convention. The German soldiers are wary and suspicious, watching their captors for signs of the cruelty they have been warned to expect. What they see instead confuses them. American soldiers going about their duties with professional efficiency, no beatings, no deliberate humiliation, just paperwork and organisation. They are loaded onto trains, not the cattle cars they might have expected, but actual passenger cars with upholstered seats, the kind of rolling stock that Wehrmacht soldiers never see, even when they are not prisoners. Some of the Germans insist among themselves that the trains must be driving in circles, that the Americans are trying to make their country seem larger than it really is, because surely no nation could actually be this vast. They watch through the windows as America rolls past, mile after endless mile of countryside that seems untouched by war. Farms with full fields, towns with lights blazing after dark, a landscape of plenty that stands in stark contrast to the Russian bombed-out cities they left behind in Germany. The train journey ends at one of the hundreds of prisoner-of-war camps that have sprung up across the American South and Southwest, facilities constructed specifically to house the flood of German and Italian prisoners that began arriving after the Allied victories in North Africa. This particular camp is in Mississippi, part of a network that will eventually hold more than 400,000 Axis prisoners scattered across 45 states. The camp consists of rows of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers, exactly what these German soldiers might have expected. What they do not expect is what they find inside those barracks when they are marched through the gates on that first evening. Each barrack is designed to hold 50 men, with proper bunks, not the straw on the floor they might have anticipated, but actual beds, with mattresses and blankets. There are wash facilities with running water, latrines that are clean and properly maintained, electric lights that work. The German officers are taken to separate quarters, given individual rooms in accordance with the Geneva Convention provisions that officers cannot be compelled to work and must be afforded greater privacy than enlisted men. The generals and admirals, those handful of high-ranking prisoners captured in North Africa, are sent to special facilities in Mississippi, where each will have his own bungalow with a private garden, accommodations that seem absurd to men who expected to be thrown into dungeon cells. But it is the next morning when the real shock comes, when the German prisoners experience something that will be talked about and written about and remembered for the rest of their lives. The mess hall bell rings for breakfast at 6 in the morning, and the Germans file in expecting the kind of thin soup and stale bread they have heard about from propaganda accounts of Allied prison camps. What they find instead stops them in their tracks. The tables are set with actual plates and silverware, not tin bowls and wooden spoons, but real dishes and metal utensils like civilized people use. And on those tables, being served by German cooks who have been given access to American military rations, is a breakfast that seems to these men like something from a peacetime dream. There is cereal, fresh and crunchy, not the reconstituted sawdust they are used to from German field rations. There is white bread, soft and fresh, real butter and jam to spread on it, not the ersatz margarine made from coal tar that has become standard in Germany. There are cornflakes, a food so exotic that many of these men have never heard of it, much less tasted it. There is coffee, real coffee made from actual coffee beans, not the acorn-based substitute that has become universal in the Wehrmacht. There is milk, fresh and cold, and sugar to put in the coffee, luxuries that have been unavailable to German civilians for years. The German prisoners sit at these tables in stunned silence, staring at the food in front of them as if it might be some kind of trick or hallucination. A young soldier from Bavaria picks up a piece of white bread and squeezes it gently, amazed at its softness, remembering the hard black bread that German soldiers have subsisted on for months. He spreads butter on it, real butter that tastes like the dairy products of his childhood, before the war turned everything into ration substitutes, and takes a bite. The expression on his face is something the American guards will remember and talk about for years afterward. A look of pure disbelief mixed with involuntary pleasure. The face of a man discovering that everything he has been told is a lie. Around him, other German prisoners are having similar moments of revelation. A sergeant from Hamburg pours milk into his coffee and adds sugar, stirring it slowly while staring into the cup as if he expects it to vanish. A corporal from Cologne eats cornflakes for the first time in his life, unsure what to make of this strange American breakfast food, but finding it surprisingly good. And slowly, almost against their will, these German soldiers begin to smile. The smiles start small and tentative, almost guilty, as if these men feel they should not be enjoying themselves, should not be taking pleasure in the food of their enemies. But the smiles grow and spread as the reality of their situation sinks in. They are not going to be starved. They are not going to be beaten or tortured. They are, in fact, going to be fed the same rations as American soldiers, as required by the Geneva Convention, which means they are going to eat better than they have eaten in years, better than German soldiers in the field, certainly better than civilians back home in increasingly desperate Germany. Some of the prisoners go back for second helpings, testing the limits of this seemingly impossible generosity, and find that they are allowed to eat as much as they want. Stories will circulate through the camp of prisoners who queue up multiple times, unable to believe that the food will not run out, until the mess officers have to establish some controls to prevent the complete exhaustion of supplies. But that first morning, that first breakfast, becomes a moment of transformation for thousands of German soldiers who are discovering that America is not what they were told it would be. In the days and weeks that follow, the pattern continues and even expands as the German prisoners adjust to their new reality. Lunch brings roast pork with potato salad and carrots, meals that would be considered luxurious in wartime Germany, where meat has become a rare treat. Dinner offers similar abundance, and the prisoners find themselves gaining weight, filling out after months of hard campaigning on inadequate rations in North Africa. One German soldier will later write to his family that when he was captured, he weighed 58 kilograms, barely more than 120 pounds, skeletal from the privations of desert warfare. After 2 years as an American prisoner of war, he will weigh 84 kilograms, 185 pounds. So much heavier that he jokes about not being able to see his eyes anymore because his face has filled out so much. The psychological impact of this good treatment proves as significant as the physical effects, as German soldiers begin to question everything they have been told about the American enemy. The transformation is not universal or immediate, as some hardcore Nazi believers among the prisoners insist that the good treatment is just a temporary trick, that the Americans will reveal their true brutality eventually. These ideological fanatics try to intimidate other prisoners, maintaining discipline according to Wehrmacht regulations even in captivity, enforcing Nazi doctrine through threats and violence. At Camp Clinton in Mississippi, a German soldier who speaks too favorably of America is murdered by these fanatics, killed for the crime of acknowledging reality. The American authorities respond by identifying the hardcore Nazis and shipping them to special camps in Oklahoma, where they can be isolated from the other prisoners, finally giving the non-political soldiers freedom to accept their situation without fear of reprisal. The relief felt by many German prisoners when these Nazi enforcers are removed reveals how much of the Wehrmacht was made up of ordinary men who never wanted Hitler's war, who were conscripted or pressured into service, who were genuinely grateful to be out of the fighting and in American hands. The camp canteens offer another revelation, as prisoners discover they can use their small stipends to purchase items that have become impossible to find in Germany. A young German soldier stands in front of the canteen shop, considering whether to buy an ice cream or a bottle of Coca-Cola first. He has not had ice cream in years, not since before the war, when such luxuries were still available to civilians in Germany. But Coca-Cola is something he has never tasted, never even seen, this mysterious American beverage that represents everything the propaganda ministry says is wrong with Western decadence. He decides to buy both, and as he stands there, eating ice cream and drinking Coca-Cola in a prisoner of war camp in the middle of America, he realizes, with perfect clarity, how lucky he is to have been captured by the Americans rather than the Russians. Stories filter into the camps about German prisoners in Soviet hands, about death rates that approach 50%, about forced labor in conditions that amount to slow execution, about soldiers who simply disappear into the vast emptiness of Siberia, never to be heard from again. The German soldiers in American camps understand they have won a kind of lottery, that the circumstances of their capture have saved their lives in ways that go far beyond merely surviving the battlefield. The work assignments begin after the initial processing period, as the camps organize the prisoners into labor details to address the severe shortage of civilian workers throughout America. The Geneva Convention prohibits forcing prisoners to work on anything directly related to the war effort, so German soldiers will not be making munitions or building military equipment. Instead, they are sent to farms to harvest crops, to lumber camps to cut timber, to food processing plants to work in canneries, doing the essential civilian labor that American men would have done if they were not overseas fighting the war. The prisoners are paid for this work, 80 cents a day for enlisted men, a small amount but enough to buy beer and cigarettes and other small comforts at the camp canteens. Officers cannot be compelled to work under Geneva Convention rules, which means German officers spend their captivity in relative leisure, pursuing hobbies and studies, an irony not lost on the enlisted men who work in the fields. The work itself is not particularly hard compared to military service, and the prisoners quickly discover that American farmers who hire them usually provide meals in addition to the camp rations, meaning the working prisoners eat even better than those who remain in camp. The interaction with American civilians proves transformative for many German prisoners, as they are forced to confront the reality that Americans are not the monsters depicted in Nazi propaganda, but ordinary people working their farms and trying to get through the war. Some prisoners work for German-American families who speak their language and treat them with kindness that seems incomprehensible after years of being told that America is the enemy. A young German soldier working on a farm in South Carolina finds himself invited to Christmas dinner by the farm family, sitting at their table and eating turkey and pie, singing Christmas carols in German, while the American family listens and joins in where they can. These moments of human connection across the lines of war prove more powerful than any amount of propaganda, as prisoners discover through direct experience that the Nazi narrative about American degeneracy and hostility is simply false. Some prisoners are so well treated that they begin to think about returning to America after the war, about staying in this country where food is plentiful and opportunities seem endless, compared to the rubble and desperation they know awaits them in defeated Germany. The education programs that develop in the camps offer another window into American life, as prisoners are allowed to take classes in English language and American history, subjects that would have been forbidden under Nazi rule, which insisted that German language and culture were superior to all others. German soldiers who have been taught that Americans are uncultured barbarians discover that America has its own rich tradition of literature and music and art, that the jazz music they have been told represents the corruption of civilization is actually complex and sophisticated. Movie nights in the camp theaters show American films that prisoners watch with fascination, seeing in Hollywood productions a vision of abundance and freedom that makes the Nazi ideal of Aryan supremacy seem hollow and desperate by comparison. Some camps organise sports leagues, where German prisoners play soccer against teams from other camps, maintaining their physical fitness while developing a sense of community among men who share the strange experience of comfortable captivity in the middle of an enemy nation. The medical care available to prisoners reinforces the lesson that America takes its Geneva Convention obligations seriously. German soldiers who are wounded or sick receive treatment in camp hospitals that are better equipped and staffed than most Wehrmacht field hospitals, with American doctors and nurses who treat enemy soldiers with the same professionalism they would show to their own troops. Prisoners who require surgery or specialized treatment are sometimes sent to civilian hospitals, where they receive care that would be unavailable to German civilians at home, where medical supplies are desperately short and hospitals are overwhelmed with casualties from Allied bombing. The contrast between American treatment of prisoners and German treatment of Russian prisoners becomes a subject of quiet conversation among the German soldiers, who are beginning to understand that the ideological brutality of the Nazi regime has made Germany into something shameful, that the war crimes being committed in Hitler's name are indefensible, regardless of whatever propaganda justifications are offered. The letters that prisoners write home to Germany, carefully censored by American authorities to prevent transmission of military information, nevertheless convey a remarkable message about conditions in the camps. German families receive letters describing meals of meat and vegetables and fresh bread, accounts of work on American farms where the prisoners are treated well and paid for their labour, descriptions of camp recreation facilities and movie theatres and sports fields. These letters create cognitive dissonance for German civilians who are enduring increasingly desperate conditions at home as Allied bombing intensifies and food becomes scarce. Some family members write back, asking if the letters are coerced, if the prisoners are being forced to lie about their treatment to make propaganda for the Americans. But the consistency of the accounts and the details that cannot be faked convince most readers that German prisoners in America really are living better than civilians in Germany, a fact that undermines Nazi propaganda about American weakness and decadence more effectively than any Allied radio broadcast could achieve. The end of the war in Europe in May 1945 brings a new uncertainty to the camps, as prisoners wonder what will happen to them now that Germany has surrendered. The immediate change is a reduction in food quality, as the American Army institutes conservation programs and substitutes ingredients that were previously abundant. The meals that were so generous during the fighting become more austere after victory, though still adequate to maintain health. Some prisoners who remember the generosity of their first American breakfast feel disappointed by the change, forgetting perhaps that even the reduced rations are better than what awaits them in occupied Germany. The repatriation process begins slowly, as American authorities are in no hurry to send prisoners back to a Germany that has been devastated by years of warfare, where cities lie in ruins and food supplies are critically short. Many prisoners express mixed feelings about returning home, grateful to have survived the war, but anxious about what they will find when they get back to Germany. The legacy of the German prisoner of war experience in America proves more significant than anyone might have predicted during those uncertain days of 1943 when the first prisoners arrived. Thousands of former prisoners will choose to return to America after the war, immigrating legally and becoming American citizens, bringing German skills and work ethic to their adopted country. Some marry American women they met during their captivity, relationships that developed despite regulations against fraternization, love finding a way even in the strange circumstances of wartime imprisonment. The children and grandchildren of these former prisoners grow up as Americans, inheriting stories about that first American breakfast, and the moment when their fathers or grandfathers realized that everything they had been told about America was wrong. The strategic implications of good treatment for prisoners prove substantial as well, as the American policy of strict adherence to Geneva Convention standards influences German treatment of American prisoners held in Wehrmacht camps. The fear that mistreatment of Allied prisoners would result in reciprocal mistreatment of German prisoners in American hands provides some protection for American airmen and soldiers captured in Europe, though this protection is far from perfect, and many American prisoners suffer terribly in German captivity. Still, the knowledge that America is treating German prisoners well creates some restraint in the Wehrmacht system, a thin thread of civilized behavior running through the brutality of total war. The contrast with Soviet treatment of German prisoners, where death rates exceed 50% and survivors endure years of forced labor in conditions that approach concentration camp brutality, makes American policy look both humane and strategically wise. The cultural impact of having 400,000 German soldiers living and working in America during the war years creates unexpected connections between former enemies. American farmers who employed German prisoners remember them as good workers. Families who hosted prisoners for holiday meals remember them as polite and grateful guests. Communities that feared having enemy soldiers in their midst discover that most of these Germans are just ordinary men caught up in circumstances beyond their control. The image of the dangerous Nazi that dominated wartime propaganda gives way to a more nuanced understanding of the German people, a recognition that not every German soldier was a committed believer in Hitler's ideology. This understanding will prove important in the post-war years, as America helps rebuild West Germany and incorporates it into the Western alliance against Soviet communism. The breakfast that shocked and delighted German prisoners in those summer days of 1943 becomes a symbol of something larger, a demonstration that American values of human dignity and fair treatment extend even to enemy soldiers, that the United States can wage war without abandoning its principles. The smiles on the faces of German prisoners encountering cereal and white bread and real coffee represent a kind of victory that never appears in military histories, the victory of basic decency over propaganda and hatred. Those moments in camp mess halls across America, when enemy soldiers discovered they would be fed well and treated fairly, did more to undermine Nazi ideology than 1,000 bombing raids or propaganda broadcasts ever could. Years later, when former German prisoners gather to share memories of their time in America, the first breakfast remains a common topic of conversation. Old men who fought for Hitler remember the disbelief they felt at being served food that was better than what German soldiers received, the confusion, and then the relief as they realised they were not going to be abused or starved. They remember the taste of that white bread with real butter, the sweetness of sugar in real coffee, the simple pleasure of eating cornflakes for the first time. And they remember the smiles, hesitant at first but then genuine, spreading across the faces of young German soldiers who were discovering that even in defeat and captivity, they were going to be treated as human beings, deserving of basic respect and adequate food. That discovery, made over breakfast in prisoner of war camps scattered across America, changed lives and shaped the post-war world in ways that military strategists never anticipated. The day German prisoners ate their first American breakfast and could not stop smiling was the day thousands of them began to understand that America was not the enemy they had been taught to hate, but a nation that could fight a war without forgetting its humanity. And that lesson, learnt at breakfast tables in Mississippi and Texas and Colorado and a dozen other states, proved more powerful and lasting than any weapon used during the war.